Welcome to Varn Vlog. Again, in the spirit of the last couple of weeks, I'm going to actually answer a question uh, on a video on path dependency and the DSA here as another video. Although at this point, it's a couple weeks back. So I'm going to flash up the two comments. There's two different commenters that left this, and I wanted to go over them because they overlay similar things and talk about the history of some comparisons, but I stripped the names off the comments as I tend to do because I prefer no one to be able to go after anyone that I talk about. So let's look at this. All right. Let's make this a little bigger, actually, for you guys to see. Okay. So I'm just going to read this comment. I fully agree with your assessment of the DSA dependence on the Democratic Party and its infrastructure and how, whether this is intentional or unintentional, this locks the DSA into a particular path. My only question is what you think the best course of action would be for the DSA, regardless of how likely you believe it is. That's a good question. Fair enough. I know that you are understandably skeptical of the dirty break strategy, particularly as when you have asked various DSA members when they plan to break from the Dems, they respond by saying they would break from the Dems when there is no threat from reactionaries to their right. That being the case, would you prefer the DSA to do a clean break strategy, albeit presumably after the party has engaged in some substantial preparation from separation from the Dems? Or is a more strategic option still the dirty break, just one that is taken more seriously and occurs at the moment of Democratic Party weakness? And regardless of how the DSA separates itself from the Democratic Party, assuming that it actually does, what sort of strategy would the DSA have in an electoral realm? Should it continue to focus on the easier path of running candidates in mostly deep blue areas like where I live, Minneapolis, St. Paul? Areas that also happen to be filled with people at the Professional-Managerial Strata, or, well, at least that and the lumpenized. Sometimes both, actually, but yeah. Or should it focus more on winning in other areas, even if this approach would likely require more resources for fewer victories? I'm just curious of what you think the best approach will be and hope you are doing well, Varn. Comment 1. Okay, comment 2. Well said, Varn. Most leftists are skeptical of the dirty break and with good reason. However, perhaps it is time for a more radical approach in regards to the Dems. They don't need the DSA because the party, the NGO, it's just 501c4. We can call it a party if we want to, but no party in the world is a 501c4. It has 501c4s subordinate to them. Is poor and small in numbers. It is poor because it actually doesn't have outside donors, and it's small in numbers relative to even progressive organizations, although it's huge for socialists. Nor do many Dems have much respect for the DSA. That may be changing, but yeah, I agree. Anyway, I should wait. If it is not the Dems, where's the DSA folks to go? It's the Dems or nothing. Shut up and get in line. And you could argue that the DSA should break from the Dems. They say it then could clear the air and present a clear alternative. The idea that the Dems can be reformed from within them seems laughable in 2026. It really does, actually. The idea that we shouldn't make a move because the right is defeatist thinking. They will always be there in one form or another. The Dems are actually the bigger enemy. If we are fighting for a future without capitalism, then the Dems are in the way, and they always have been. Yeah, I've talked about this in my Are the Dems Control Opposition? No, but they still suck. Couple of videos. The DSA really has no good reason to remain cheerleading to the Dems. A dirty break is not easy because sometimes divorce is the only way forward. Now, there's a lot here. I'm going to say that the partyist position actually does seem to be the dominant one in the DSA, although that may be changing with the influx of several thousand people into the NYC DSA specifically, and the flurry of endorsements that have occurred as Mondani sets out his budget, which is balanced mostly by, unfortunately, and I can back this up, not even all the the budget support he got from Hoke Hill, not his pet-a-terre tax. It's from cutting the city's contribution to pensions. Muy progressive, I suppose. And that balanced budget in and of itself does not and cannot lead to a massive expenditure of social functions beyond what he's already done with the help of Hochul. So there's been a massive expenditure of endorsements to hope to grow off this moment, but with very little strategic vision or coordination for the DSA where to go. And it has tied the DSA more than before back to the Dems, regardless of the last 2 years of frustration post-Biden, so much that you have people who I think are fairly principled, like Geese Magazine. I don't always agree with their popular front strategy. I don't really think it works, but at least I think they're clear and principled about it. Like really hoping for an AOC presidential run, which I think is funny because an AOC presidential one is actually not really a challenge to the party. We can get into why, but it really isn't. After all, it brings a whole lot of excitement back in, and when AOC doesn't win a nomination, or even if she does and has to make conciliatory gestures towards the center, that movement is now captured back in within the Democratic Party. See Bernie campaign version 1. But we're going to do a strategic and structural breakdown of these two comments, identifying the core contradictions and the historical weight behind each of the terms. Then I'm going to try to answer the tactical forks in the road that they present, and we can work from there. So the core strategic dilemma here is staying versus a dirty versus a clean break. We're going to focus on only two of those right now, and we'll come back to the benefits of staying later. Both comments orbit around the central anxiety of the modern socialist electoral strategy, which is how to handle the electoral and structural trap of the Democratic Party ballot line when you don't have the numbers to overcome it. So let's break down that first commenter's comments. The commenter correctly identifies the psychological and political blocker to the dirty break, which is using the Democratic Party ballot line with an explicit intent to split later, or an attempt to use their own ballot line as a party surrogate within the party, but still subordinate to the party's larger disciplinary mechanisms by doing so. When the condition for breaking, when your best option for a negotiated agreement, basically, is when the right is no longer a threat, that break will never happen. The right will always be a threat. The threat reaction functions as a permanent blackmail to enforce discipline. And it is true that while both sides of the equation are not equal, they're not the same in the way that they manage capital, they're not the same in the way that they handle everything, they use that to effectively limit your ability to even think about how to handle the situation at hand. The commenter proposes a clean break alternative and asks, it's heavily prepared, and we can talk about what that may mean, an immediate clean break running exclusively on an independent third-party line might be preferable, or if a disciplined dirty break executed during a moment of profound democratic vulnerability is more viable. Now, the problem with the latter, obviously, is that will risk empowering the right. You would have had a time to do that actually in 2022 to 2024. So, moment of profound weakness for the Democrats. They've been in disarray since then. Even Kamala Harris is calling on their leadership to release the autopsy of the situation. And yet, it seems like despite that prompting the partyist wings within the DSA electoral advantage at the convention, and despite that rhetoric now being in the majority of the leadership caucuses in the DSA, even ones that I would sometimes call the DSA right, Which does not mean they're right wing, by the way. I want to be very clear on that. When I'm saying someone's a DSA right, it means they're conciliatory towards the state of play that exists now. They all have apparently do eventually want a break or a party surrogate to become a party. But there's a bunch of problems with this. There's a crucial observation of electoral geography. Currently, the DSA finds success in deep blue urban enclaves, LA, New York, Minneapolis, St. Paul, etc. The comment notes that these areas are highly populated by professional-managerial strata. And even if you look at the areas where the DSA is most popular in those areas, and I can even comment to that here in Salt Lake, the DSA has very little presence on the west side of the city. While there are plenty of members in my chapter of color, and they come from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, and they come from all over Utah, the focus of where things happen, where the candidates we run are, actually, this one, the Tom Patton campaign is more tied to the east of the city and South Salt Lake. The east of the city being predominantly upper middle class. South Salt Lake is a little bit more working class, lower middle class, although less so than where I live, which is in Kearns. Now, you might be bored by the geography, but this shows up in the DSA in New York too, which is really strong in Brooklyn and to a lesser degree in Manhattan. But you see sharp die-offs in the other boroughs. And there being almost no DSA presence in the Bronx whatsoever, which would be the most working class parts of the neighborhood and the blue collar, white collar distinction of working class. The problem with this is twofold. All right. One, the professional managerial strata, even if they are parts of the working class, have their own unique interests that are often different than the West of the blue collar working class, or even some kinds of service and white collar workers. Two, they're used to areas with high taxation concentration. Three, it means that they also don't bring anything to the bargaining table with the Democrats because these are areas where the Democrats already control. They might be able to leverage their control over these areas, but there's no way in most of these areas that the DSA actually is a threat where the right can take over. Now, you will say that makes the battle for the DSA easier, but it means also when it comes to national level negotiations, the DSA doesn't bring that much to the table. On state and local negotiations, they might, but they're dealing with entities that don't have currency sovereignty and they are more limited by budget. So, should the DSA double down on these relatively easy high-yield victories and bourgeois, particularly finance areas, are PMS-heavy districts, which do have working class members? I am not saying that I think that the PMS is the same, and I'm just going to start calling that. In my book with Daniel Tutt, we also used the Palantis and called them like the new petty bourgeois. Although my exact statement is that a lot of the PMS is not petty bourgeois anymore, but has a petty bourgeois habitats from the years in which their education and licensing were tied to being independent professionals that could work on their own, as opposed to being employees, is which even many doctors are now. That is a significant distinction, one noticed by Christian Polarity, etc. But it means, one, that they have a particular relationship to the state, and two, and this is actually important to notice, that their habits of mind are implicated by petite bourgeois professional habits. And those are different from other forms of petite bourgeois. I mean, the lawyer who can sell his knowledge base and access to the license to use that knowledge based on the market has a different petty bourgeois incentive structure than the bodega owner or the car dealership huckster or whatever. All right. Should they pivot more towards blue collar working class areas where victories are harder, costlier, and scarcer, but are more ideologically coherent and would actually bring a bargaining chip in trying to deal with the Dems, because you would have a base that is not already captured, particularly if you're pulling from exurban and rural areas, not just blue cities. So that's one thing to break down and talk about. The other commenter talks about the power of asymmetry. This commenter cuts through the noise regarding DSA's leverage, because the DSA doesn't have a lot of leverage. As I've said, it's not in the position to protect its elected, so it's also not in the position to discipline them. And the reverse is also true. If you can't discipline them, you also can't protect. The Democratic Party apparatus does not need the DSA. It has, and I've now gone into many of them in a video in detail, myriads of organizations that do not have the want to be as forward on their self-funding as the DSA does, that can probably get more done for them. The DSA lacks the numbers, the political and literal capital, and the institutional muscle to force concessions outside of very specific areas, mostly New York. And the internal message from the party establishment is simple: shut up and get in line, and we'll throw you some scraps. And we might make some of you part of our apparatus later on. By 2026, this commenter is right to say that the historical thesis of realignment, reforming the Democratic Party from within, is widely recognized as dead, even within the DSA. But this leads us to a lesser evil paradox. What the commenter argues that treating the right as a permanent boogeyman leads to defeatism. More provocatively, they assert that the Democratic Party is a primary structural obstacle to anti-capitalist politics, something I'm not actually sure is true. But I do think this idea that it successfully co-ops, neutralizes, and absorbs left-wing energy that is outside of the spectrum of the current political axis is actually true. The divorce analysis is interesting. The conclusion here is clean and sharp. Continuing to cheerlead for the Dems is a dead end, and a clean break, even if painful and isolating, would establish a clear independent political alternative. Fine. But let's look at two key themes here. We need to address why the dirty break has devolved into a permanent holding pattern within its 10 years of operation, and in most cases isn't even argued for anymore, but is argued as a party surrogate strategy, which again, an NGO is not really in the position to do. The argument that we can't leave yet because the fascist threat ignores the fact the Democratic Party in its inability or lack of want, depending on how you want to interpret it, to deliver material improvements is precisely what fuels the growth of the reactionary right. It is a symbiotic loop. In fact, you can see this most explicitly in Biden normalizing many Trump policies, rationalizing them, make them more humane, allowing Trump to pivot to the right of himself, not just Biden, by claiming his prior policies were Biden's policies. And then and doing so also lead to a total disregard for the Biden as the most progressive president since FDR bullshit that we were hitting from even people like Bhaskar Sankara. This meant that when the Democratic Party could not deliver on anything and kept telling people that it was delivering on a better economy, and it was delivering on a better economy for the rich who didn't turn on them anyway because they didn't see a future in that line of growth. And the Democratic Party, which had been seen since Obama as the more rational moderator of capital, had lost that status because its inability to come up with clear answers in 2022, 2023, and 2024 led to the return of Trump. I don't know how you can ignore that. The mention of places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Professional-Managerial Strata is a pivot point. Running candidates in gentrified or highly educated urban cores allows for easy electoral wins, but it tethers the organization to two things. One, the class interest of a particular strata of the working class, rather than an organized working class as a whole. You see this in the focus on particular things. We must rate the value of an easy win that looks that looks strong but yields a weak class discipline against a hard loss that builds an actual independent class base. If the dirty break is a myth, then the clean break feels suicidal under the current ballot access laws and first past the post voting, then what is the real alternative? This requires exploring what substantial preparation for separation would look like and focusing less on the ballot box in the immediate term, even if it does lead to a spike in cadres and membership dues, and building more independent working class institutions, labor unions, tenant unions, parallel media that can survive the shadow of the state regulated party system is important. Regardless of whether or not you did an insider outsider strategy, you would need more of these more robustly than currently exist. And I do not mean let 1,000 podcasters and many Patreons bloom, even though I'm a benefit from that. That is not actually a strategy of much of anything. It's actually a strategy for self-capture. So let's start dismantling this break the economy. The fundamental flaw in the dirty break strategy as practiced by the DSA is it treats a structural dependency as a temporary tactical maneuver while making the structural dependency deeper. The first commenter hits the nail on the head regarding the response from the DSA members. We will break when the right-wing threat is gone. This is a psychological and structural trap. There is a symbiotic loop between the Democratic Party and the reactionary right. They are mutually constitutive opponents. And in fact, they double down on each other to keep it stable. The Democratic Party requires the threat of the reactionary right to justify its own existence while offering little material concessions to the working class, or even much provable racial and gender benefits to the marginalized groups that it claims to care the most about, but treats as a foregone and obvious demographic that it's captured. You didn't see clean or sensible reforms on immigration one way or the other, whether you wanted a more Heron folk variety of that or whether you wanted immigration liberalization, you got neither. And there's been a refusal to deal with the stresses on the blue collar workforce, in particular with immigration, while also sometimes parroting right wing talking points. Thank you, fucking Bernie Sanders, when you get on certain shows and start talking about how Biden let the doors open to immigration, which is not even remotely fucking true. And I am not a Biden fan. Because the Democrats also enforce authority. In fact, they're often better at it. In managing the decline of capital, they inherently generate social friction that fuels right-wing reaction when they're in charge. And when they're not in charge, they can always hide behind the scariness of that right-wing reaction. If you condition your independence on the absence of a right-wing threat, you have surrendered your strategic autonomy to a permanent loop. The dirty break effectively becomes an alignment with radical aesthetics or an alignment with a reactionary veto in practice. If a dirty break is a hostage situation, is a cream break the answer? The second commenter is right that the idea that the internal reform of the Democratic Party does seem dead in 2026. Schumer is still in charge. You've seen people like Cory Booker and Hakeem Jeffries, both of whom were considered outsiders at one time, both of whom were darlings of the progressives 10 to 15 to 20 years ago, be very cynical in their reactions and use of the situation. You've also seen working class progressive candidates basically fool DSAers on aesthetics alone. See Featherman. That's why I am neither pro or anti Graham Plantner. I think we can't know what he really will be until he's in office if he gets there. I suspect that we'll probably have a lot more to answer for than you think, because putting a lot of these people into office prematurely without large bundles to support them often leads to a frustrated electorate, which turns against them. Anyway. A clean break that merely swaps out the ballot line while keeping the exact same electoral first methodology is a recipe for immediate marginalization the U.S. is duopolistic. Sorry, I'm reading my own notes. Ballot access laws state by state. Even in areas where you get ranked choice voting, something that 19 states have made illegal, by the way, you have interesting issues with that not really leading to the total progressive reforms that you might want. Literally, the only case where I've seen this be used in a way strategically helpful to socialists was New York City. For a clean break to be anything more than a third-party suicide pact where your rhetoric and framing gets slowly incorporated into the main party's line, but also emptied out of any radical or even substantive reforms, substantial preparation cannot mean just raising more money or knocking on more doors for independent campaigns, which stand an even less of a chance to win. It means shifting what we mean by political power. Which is, by the way, what socialist parties often did historically because they were often illegal. At least we're not that. Although for some of us, it would actually force us to think more clearly. All right. State-regulated ballot boxes is an away game played on bourgeois territory. You need to play the game. You need to play the game. I'm not saying you don't. I am in the Marxist center because I do not reject all electoralism, although I'm an obstructionist electoralist. We are to use the election ballot to create some space for working class reforms that could help them, and to then also crush reactionary measures. That's it. And that would be perceived by progressives as being reactionary itself, since we would not necessarily like for them to expand state agencies and whatnot in ways that are not controlled by the working class, even if they lead to working class benefits. It does mean building independent working class institutions, independent tenant unions, aggressive rank and file labor caucuses within existing unions, and self-funded media and educational infrastructure that is coordinated and not just about making individuals well off. This can will power outside of the state before trying to ratify power within the state. Without that base, a third-party ballot line is just a vanguard without an army, which means it's not much of anything at all. Now, this makes almost everybody unhappy. Because no, you can't just go form a Green Party. No, you can't just double down on your union work, which probably isn't doing what you want anyway. If almost everyone I know on the rank and file unions have hit structural walls that we barely talk about. If you want me to talk about, we can talk about the charters of it. And it does mean that even if you do take a hostile stance towards the Democratic Party, when you are working with these things, you will often have to try to use them. But notice I said use them, not be subordinated to them. Now, we also have to deal with the geography of class composition. The first commenter's observation about Minneapolis St. Paul hits on a hidden material driver of the DSA's political line. It's class composition and electoral geography. Why does the DSA stay in the deep blue urban cores for the most part? Because it's an electorally cheap and yields immediate dopamine hits and immediate things that look like wins, but does not necessarily translate to policy and does not necessarily break them out of subordination to the much richer elements of the Democratic Party that have a much more deep pocketbook. These areas are so heavily populated by NGO workers, academic, tech workers, cultural industry professionals, teachers, nurses, etc. Although teachers and nurses are in this weird middle ground of this strata, I think teachers and nurses have the advantage of actually working with a whole lot of the working class and even the lumpenized classes. Are the weaponized sections of the working class, because at this point there's not much in the United States that's outside of of a bourgeois, petite bourgeois, proletarianized strata. There might be 15 or 16 classes in Marx, but there's only about 5 of any size here. Winning an election in a professional managerial strata heavy district requires very little class struggle. It does require a savvy ground game, a progressive platform, and capturing an existing Democratic Party electorate and its resources. But these victories are detached from the organized working class of any mass. Even when you focus on unions, and the DSA has, you tend to be in some of the most protected areas of the working class. Vast majority of the blue-collar workforce is not in unions. About 80% of it isn't. More than that, I think, actually. And the public sector unions, which isn't even a majority of public sector workers either, I think it's something like 45% of them, also has the issue that the largest of its unions are the teachers' unions, fine, great, but then the next one down is the police unions and the fraternal orders of police. And you're never going to get rid of them in the AFL-CIO because it would probably lead to an NCLB backlash, even though they're not covered by the NCLB anyway. But B, and more importantly, it's too much of a dues base. Because these victories are detached from the working class, and because of where they do attach to the working class, they're in very specific strata. I mean, the CWA, the teachers' unions, the nurses' unions are way overrepresented in the parts of the DSA that are actually in unions and not just in union staffing. They inevitably get absorbed by the legislative logic of the Democratic caucus or by the various super PACs attached to the unions, which make the decisions on endorsements. So you have to ask your question: how do you deal with a hard loss versus an empty win? If the DSA wants to be a socialist organization rather than a left wing of the NGO apparatus, its electoral geography has to change fundamentally. So let's think about this in some key terms. White collar strategy, which we should not completely abandon. I am not saying we do not need the professional managerial strata and urban progressives. We do. Their resource cost to get them is low to medium because there's an existing progressive infrastructure, particularly after Bernie Sanders, although one that is increasingly suspect and part of the Democratic Party. Its political yield are high seat counts, low structural power. It yields politicians who have a base, but often have to compromise under pressure because they aren't bringing new people into the coalition. They're trying to express the wishes of people already in the Democratic coalition more clearly and keep them aligned. And while that's not nothing, it is not the same as bringing new people in, which is why the Democratic Party structurally tends towards concessions to the right of its base. But what would a working class strategy look like? One that actually merged these two stratas of the proletariat today. And I know people are funny with me calling the PMS part of the proletariat, but it is being proletarianized. That is why it is downwardly mobile. And this is going to be accelerated by AI. So you do have skills that you can get and work with here that you could really use from the strata if you can also subordinate them. I am in that strata. I am not saying we should give it up. But if you look at deindustrialized zones, logistic hubs, diverse poor suburbs, not just rich ones, rural areas, exurban areas. This requires high multi-year base building and a deep, deep sense of patience. It's a low immediate seat count because you're not going to get a lot of wins immediately, but a high in structural leverage. It builds a disciplined class conscious blocks that actually can bring new people to the coalition that you can wage against corporate Democrats. It is a game strategic way to go about it, even if you think the electoral path is a way to do so. And if you're looking for something beyond merely being a subordinate junior partner in the Democratic Party, it's about the only way you're ever going to fucking begin to do it. Focusing on resources on areas where victories are harder and scarcer is not just better optics, it is a structural necessity. A single city council member or state representative backed by a militant organized logistics or logistic adjacent working class base possesses a lot more leverage against capital than 5 representatives elected in progressive professional areas in a gentrified district where, yes, they do have a lot of influence and can express the progressive attitude they're in, but they don't bring much new to the table because those demographics were voting for Democrats before you got there. If we combine the 2 comments and these 2 different strains of critique, we can start looking at a best course of action, regardless of how unlikely the current leadership is to take it. 1, stop prioritizing the ballot box, even if you're still going to do electoralism. If you do prioritize the ballot box, focus on nonpartisan elections where you can win at city levels to build up a base where upper intermediaries like the mayorate, the executive, our higher level legislators could have a base lower down and do some vertical and horizontal alignment. Cease treating electoral politics and the popularity of your cadres as the primary metric of organizational health or socialist growth. You are not just moving an Overton window. You are trying to build a power base with leverage, and a militant leverage at that. Electoral work should be a tool for agitation, propaganda, and obstruction. It is not the primary goal, unless you can rule independently. So the moment it becomes a primary goal, you would need to have organizations and a base larger than what is currently half-heartedly dictated to the Democratic Party. You need to accept the cost of separation, accepting that breaking from the Democratic Party infrastructure will mean losing seats in the short term. The organization must be willing to trade legislative seats that do not generate policy gains for both leverage, ideological, and organizational coherence, and the ability to enact policy, or to even do more militant actions. A pivoting towards an organized working class means to redirect resources out of the PM strata enclaves and into the workplaces and neighborhoods where the rubber meets the road of capital accumulation. Logistics, healthcare, manufacturing. So you do still need a lot of the PMS strata. You also could use teachers better because teachers have outreach into the community and deal with the community in a larger way, in ways that many other people, even working class people, don't. Now, I have my criticism of tenants unions, and I'm going to do a whole video on that as well. But I think tenants unions are a way to get broad-based support with a relatively low entry of getting into the game. But the issue, and this is not an insignificant issue, is the structural barriers for tenant union success beyond that initial growth. They're actually higher than traditional workplace-based unions. And the tendency of frustration leading to more legalistic concessions, just like you saw with the unions, is also likely. So I'm against left populism, whether PMC are blue collar coded, because they're just counter elitist, for whether they realize it or not. And you must be willing to take strategic losses to build a power base, something that reactionaries do actually understand and have done over a course of 4 generations to eventually complete their dominance over the Rockefeller Republican of the mid-20th century. It's been a long road from the Birchers through Goldwater, through Reagan, through Trump. but they have known when to take strategic losses to do it. And they took over their party. And even with that, they've hit real limits about what they can do and how independent they could possibly be. Now, to exactly see how modern organizations like the DSA are caught in structural traps, we should look at a historical mirror. When we examine the Socialist Party of America, the Communist Party USA, the German SPD, and the French Socialist Party, the SFIO/PS, clear historical laws of left-wing organization do begin to take shape. Every single one of these organizations faced the exact same folks in the road regarding electoral lines, class composition, and the temptation of institutional absorption as the DSA. And that's not even getting into the SDS or the various small sectarian groups. I only pick groups that had something akin to a mass base for this discussion. So you're not going to hear me talk about the SPUSA, even though I was a fellow traveler at one time. You're not going to hear me talk about the various sectarian groups, like the 15 different revolutionary communist parties, the various socialist workers' parties, the various progressive labor parties, etc. If we look at the Socialist Party of America, we can see the inside-outside strategy is not what it pursued. The current DSA debate over the dirty break isn't new. It is a repackaging of strategies thoroughly tested by the early 20th century American left. The early SPA under Eugene Debs was fiercely committed to a cream Blake because the prior existing organizations, such as the Knights of Labor or the People's Party, did not do so. The People's Party was absorbed into the Democratic Party through the concessions of William Jennings Bryan. The Knights of Labor never were really a force that really broke from either of the two parties and actually tried to remain somewhat apolitical. Deb refused on principle to run on or support any capitalist ballot line, period. The SPA was built on an independent apparatus, which made it large. And yes, it had a lot of weird Heron folk-esque people in it and a lot of people that we might even consider like ultra-left syndicalists today, but it had a lot of people. It was exponentially larger than the DSA. Now, I say exponentially larger because it had a dues-paying membership of only about 115,000 at its height, but it commanded about 900,000 votes, which was 6% of the popular vote at the time. To put the 113 to 115 figure into historical perspective, it made the SPA one of the top 5 largest socialist parties in the world at the time relative to its national population, commanding a vast ecosystem of over 300 elected officials, all independent, dozens of mayors, and several radical press networks from publications like Appeal to Reason, and deep alliance with the IWW. It is also worth noting that even after declines after 1912 and 1919, it still had about the same amount of members as the DSA now, and that was after the fallout from the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. But it was very different from 1919. By 1919, over 53% of the party's membership was organized within the autonomous foreign language federations, which were French, Polish, South Slavic, European immigrants, many of which have been deeply radicalized by the Russian Revolution, but weren't necessarily on board with it. Fearing a radical takeover, the moderate English-speaking internal leadership under figures like Morris Hillquit carried out the mass expulsions of the foreign language federations in 1919, cutting away 20,000 members. Between those bureaucratic expulsions and the subsequent state-led repressions of the Palmer raids, the exit of the left wing to form a precursor organization of the SPUSA, the SPA's membership collapsed from 105,000 in 1919 to literally only 26,000 by 1920, and was down to 13,000 by 1921. It never recovered its mass proletarian character again. The SPA, though, had an independent apparatus. Like I said, it had hundreds of newspapers. It had encampments to take care of the homeless. It had deep roots in specific radicalized sectors. The Oklahoma tenant farmers, the Midwestern railway workers, and the Jewish garment workers in New York were all pretty heavily involved in the SPA. Because the SPA's political line was anchored in the unorganized or militantly organized working class, not professional reformers, they were willing to lose repeatedly to build an uncompromised socialist identity and to have candidates that were able to carry that line, even though they had a broad spectrum of membership, too broad actually to join up with the Comintern and be involved with the Third International, partly because they were so broad they couldn't adhere to the 21 points attached to the Bolshevik program, which led you to be able to enter the International. By the late 1930s and 1940s, under Norman Thomas in particular, the SPA began to surrender its independent ballot line to support FDR's New Deal coalition from the outside. Once the SPA accepted that the Democratic Party was the only game in town for delivering immediate reforms, it pretty much finished signing its own death warrant. It lumbered along, even participating in the Red Scare in the 1950s, but losing its working class base almost entirely and shrank to a New York-centric group of intellectuals that eventually birthed a couple of different groups, including the DSOC, Michael Harrington's group, which codified the realignment strategy that defined the pre-2015-2016 DSA, which never grew beyond 5,000 members. So they didn't get much for their anti-communism. They didn't get much for capitulating to a progressive line. They actually froze, and their only growth period was in the early period of the DSA's formation in 1982 to the re-election of Ronald Reagan in 1984, and then their involvement in the Rainbow Coalition. From that point forward, particularly after Dinkins, the DSA was stuck at a cadre membership between 3,000 and 7,000. Now let's talk about the CPUSA. If the SPA shows what happens when you abandon an independent party line after you had done the hard work to build one, the SPA under Earl Browder in the 1930s and 40s shows the exact endpoint of modern lesser evilism as an argument. The lesser evil, veto. Facing the global rise of fascism, the Comintern eventually mandated the populist front strategy after its success in Italy and France once they did it on their own in 1936. In the U.S., this meant that the SPUSA effectively mothballed its independent electoral campaigns to build a defensive wall around FDR and the New Deal Democrats who fought the reactionary right, leading a bunch of communists even to join the Democratic Party and even serve in the government, which has led to all kinds of fun things today, like conspiracy theories about who was in the OSS, which almost all the major communist leaders were, even the Soviet-aligned ones, because the Popular Front demanded it. The CPUSA had immense structural leverage. They had organized the CSO with John Lewis, led the most militantly anti-racist struggles in the South, and had some real pull in the civil rights organization. And while they never got more than 90,000, they were a large organization for the United States. So this requires me to give you a brief history of the CPUSA. The trajectory of the CPUSA presents a highly illuminating roller coaster narrative of membership statistics. Unlike the SPA, which functioned as a loose, open membership electoral party, which did have dues-paying members, which is more than most electoral parties did, but was still fairly loose in organization. The CPUSA was a highly disciplined bureaucratic cadre organization. It demanded strenuous commitments, regularly purged its ranks, and required strict adherence to an international party line. At least it had to nominally subordinate itself to the Comintern. Consequently, while official card-carrying membership numbers were often lower than the SPA's peak, its actual structural leverage over millions of organized workers was somewhat larger in the middle of the 20th century. Following the 1919 splits from the SPA and the immediate suppression of the Palmer raids, the early communist movement was entirely underground and fractured in competing sects, and many different sects competed for recognition of the Comintern. Once it emerged as an above-ground organization as the Worker Party in America in 1922, the party stabilized through the 1920s as a small, militant, but largely immigrant force. Its membership was consistently between 7,000 and 12,000 people, which is larger than most sects, particularly the New Communist and New Left sects, but was still very small. Even in the Great Depression, which devastated the American economy, the party's numbers didn't really skyrocket. By 1933, despite aggressive marches of the unemployed councils, which were led by communists, official membership remained below 20,000. In running for office, the CPUSA never got more than 2% of the vote. Its heyday was the Popular Front period in 1930, from 1935 to 1947. In the late 1930s, there was a surge, although there was also, in the middle of that, there was a decline. So, in 1936, the membership was fairly large. But right after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there was a massive drop in membership. They lost probably about 20,000. But when that was reversed by 1939, communists integrated themselves into the CAO. Their membership surged to about 66,000. So they went from the TEUL and the TEEL into the CAO, which was subordinated under John Lewis, who was not a communist. But their ability to organize and their devotion to cadre leadership, particularly during the beginnings of the Popular Front period, led to a spike. Now, their absolute peak was somewhere between 80 to 85,000 members. Some internal tracking pointed to roughly 100,000 membered registered books during a short-lived transition to the Communist Political Association in 1944, according to my notes. But the roles that were accounted for by internal audits that have been looked up say that the height was about 85,000 members. By the end of the war, the party still held an official count of 75,000, probably. But it is critical to note that the CPA's power was multiplied tenfold by its front organizations, which the SPA did not have. They had the IWO, which was a fraternal insurance and cultural society, which boasted an additional 250,000 members at its peak. The CAO was massive, which had over 1.2 million workers, of which the communists had a disproportionate leadership in those organizations before their purge in the 1950s. But there were three great drops in the CPUSA in the early period. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact dropped the membership profoundly between 1939 and 1940. They dropped from 66,000 to 40,000 overnight. Earl Browder's presidential campaign from prison netted a meager 46,000 votes. So, Earl Browder pulled the same thing as Devs, but with nowhere near the ballot control. This drop was only corrected after Germany invaded the USSR in June of 1941, causing the party to reverse the line again. And when in doing so, they'd experienced a massive World War II boom. The second structural decline was driven by intense systemic state repression and institutional exclusion during the Red Scare, which was actually, ironically, made more easy because of the Smith Act, and later the Taft-Hartley Act. So the Smith Act of 1940 enabled people to indict and imprison the top echelon of CPUSA leadership. And then the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 forced union officials to sign non-communist affidavits or lose their position. The fatal blow to the party's social leverage came in 1914-1915 when the CAO officially expelled 11 major left-led unions, including the massive UEW, which is still historically one of the most radical trade unions, severing the CPUSA from its organic connection to the industrial working class. Then it was hunted by the FBI, blacklisted from employment, and isolated from mainstream labor. Its fronts shut down systemically. Membership dropped down to roughly 25,000 by 1953 and about 5,000 by 1955. In 1956, there was a crisis. The Second Red Scare had stripped the CPUSA of its base. The events of 1946 shattered the internal ideological convictions of the remaining hardcore cadre. The 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech, which officially detailed and condemned the crimes, the use of China, and the cult of personality around Stalin. Furthermore, the Sino-Soviet split further hit the numbers as you started seeing more and more, like you saw all over the world, communist groupings break in response to this. Later on, the Soviet military crushed the Hungarian Revolution, which caused many people who had been on the Soviet side, unlike people like Bloch and some other people who had actually, even sided with the Soviets during the Stalin period, to finally break. Its membership plummeted by 1955 to between 3,000 and 5,000. In the 1960s, it was stagnant at about 5,000. In the 1970s, during the new communist movement, we saw the CPUSA bump up to about 7,000 or 8,000. As all the Marxist-Leninist sects actually did pretty well in response to the seeming failures of the New Left. But then by the 1980s, they were all in massive decline. Furthermore, there's a lot of evidence from declassified documents that like a significant portion of paying members by the 1960s were actually informants. Something that when people talk about the problems of Western Marxism, but they don't talk about the actual Comintern aligned parties and how they were fucking filled with informants by the 1960s, kind of makes the focus on a bunch of intellectuals a little bit weird. Anyway, I'm going to pause this, and unfortunately, this is going to have a part 2. We'll come back. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can always find more behind the Patreon wall. You get access for as little as $4. Leave a comment to help me out, or don't. It doesn't matter. It does help the algorithm, though. Even if you hate me. All those haters, leave comments. I might even like them because I encourage you to leave more comments. You only make my power grow. Having a good day.